But on to tonight's business. We are delighted to welcome David Blight this evening, who is the class of 1954 professor of American history at Yale University, where he is also the director of the Gilder Lehrman Center for the Study of Slavery, Resistance, and Abolition. David is one of our leading historians of slavery and resistance, particularly of the legacies of the Civil War. His books include American Oracle, The Civil War and the Civil Rights Era, 2011, and A Slave No More, Two Men Who Escaped to Freedom, including their narratives of emancipation, published in 2007. He's also the author of Race and Reunion, The Civil War and American Memory, which received 8 book awards, including the Bancroft Prize, the American Lincoln Prize, the Frederick Douglass Prize, as well as 4 awards from the Organization of American Historians. The other books of which David is either the author or the editor are too numerous to list here, but they include books on Frederick Douglass, the Underground Railroad, and the politics of the Civil War era. If you haven't read any of David's books, you very likely read one of his book reviews or essays, which appear frequently in the Washington Post, the Chicago Tribune, the Boston Globe, and other newspapers. Or if you have children in college, they've probably read some of his work in the best-selling college American history textbook, The People in the Nation, of which David is an author. He's also an active public historian, teaching summer institutes for secondary teachers and for park rangers and for historians in the National Park Service. Since we're in an anniversary mood these days at AAS, it's especially fitting that David's talk tonight is titled From Emancipation to Civil Rights and Beyond, Legacies of the Civil War at 150. Please join me in welcoming David Blight back to AAS.
Thank you, Mr. Erickson. Thank you, Jim Moran, for planning this. Thank you, Ellen, for dinner across the street. I just feel like we ought to just keep celebrating the Antiquarian Society. Let's just have a love fest. Forgive me a couple of quick stories. Any of us who've worked here have these stories, of course. I actually, in some ways, started Race and Reunion, the book that was just mentioned, around that corner in a little carol in the back. It started it years earlier, but didn't know what I was doing. But on a 1-month fellowship here in what I think was the fall of 2006, your collection actually goes a little beyond Reconstruction, because it was here that I first found that massive volume of Memorial Day speeches. It's this huge thing that somebody compiled. And you have a copy of it. It wasn't even published until the early 20th century. And I remember thinking, aha, they do go beyond 1877. I love this place. I actually negotiated my contract on Race and Reunion in the, what used to be the phone booth back. Is there still a phone booth? Still a phone booth? You don't need it. Nobody uses it anymore. There's a phone booth. There wasn't much money in that contract, but we had I and my legendary editor, Joyce Seltzer, had a rowdy discussion from that phone booth on the day I said, yes, whatever you want to give me. Fine. And she did, and I did. Also, the photograph of Frederick Douglass on my edition of Douglass's narrative comes from the Antiquarian Society. I've used many illustrations from the Antiquarian Society. In fact, Ellen mentioned this at dinner. Every year when I start my lecture course at Yale, I do something to just make my students squirm for a few minutes, embarrass myself and therefore them a little to get their attention. It's usually at least 200 students, and I always walk out into the hall and I put a book in my hand. It's the point where you're explaining the syllabus and why are we reading this and why are we reading that. I almost always use Douglass's narrative, a little thin volume. In part because it was written by a former slave in a world that didn't believe former slaves could write. And I walk out among them and I hold the book like a newborn. I pat it. I give it my cheek. I rub it. And they start squirming. What's this guy doing? And I just try to get them to think with me for 2 minutes how precious these things are. Even though we throw them on the floor, we throw them in and out of our backpacks. And then I go back up on the stage and I explain the rest of the syllabus and they get more comfortable. Bill Reese on the film there when he talked about the moment that we all have finding something. If you're a historian at all, you've had that moment. And I've had a few in this place. Anyway, I'll stop. But It's always a thrill to walk in here. It really is. And an honor to give one of these lectures. I am going to talk about this problem of how we as Americans remember and forget, process the remembering and forgetting of our Civil War and of Emancipation. Seems like I've been writing about this for 20 years in one way or another. And I did skip ahead into the 20th century, which meant I couldn't use the Antiquarian Society for the most recent book called American Oracle, which really is about the Civil Rights era and how American culture was trying to have a Civil War Centennial commemoration, and they had a massive affair. At the same time, we were having the Civil Rights Revolution. Back to that more in just a moment. But on this question of memory, or how we think about memory, you and I obviously understand memory instinctively and immediately when it's an individual matter. I mean, it's obvious to us. We can't function without our individual memories. Our very humanity is tied up in it. And the older we get, the more aware we become of how much our humanity is caught up in our ability to remember. And I'll spare you my own examples because I know we all have them. Where did I park my car? What's my phone? Does anyone know their phone number anymore? They're all keyed into our cell phones, right? We don't even need the passwords. Where are your passwords? You ever worry about the day when you forget your passwords? Might as well just cash it in. It's all over. I mean, we understand memory on that level. It's when memory, of course, becomes collective. And we're met in one of the great libraries in this country, and obviously this is a repository of collective memory. We instinctively know that too. But how do you know a collective memory when you meet one? What is a collective memory? How do groups actually remember? Now, we know some obvious ways. They build monuments. They write songs about themselves. They create creation stories. They have all kinds of rituals. They create stories they believe they're living in. All peoples do it. It's one of the things that has made the study of memory so hot or persistent in historical studies. Finally, the anthropologists were on this topic ever since there's been anthropology. Historians have only really come to it, especially in America, in the last 20, 25 years or so, although Michael Kamen was really doing this when he was 18 years old, I think. He just called it tradition and other things than memory. But all peoples do this, and it has everything to do with how we identify, how we define ourselves, how we imagine the story we believe we're living in. But that's, of course, what is so contested about it, isn't it? Who creates the story? Who owns it? Who writes it? Who invents it? Who gets to control the narrative, as they say in politics? One of the greatest things I've ever read on memory, still, is one of the oldest. It's in St. Augustine's Confessions. In the 4th century. If you have a copy of Augustine's Confessions, go revisit it. There's about a 40-50 page section where Augustine meditates on the nature of memory, about as brilliantly as I think anyone ever had. He calls memory the treasury in our mind. He said its manifoldness is so great no one has ever imagined the bottom thereof. He writes about the infinity, the potential infinity of our memory. Now, we know he's not quite right about that because we're losing the grip on that infinity every day, but we believe in it, don't we? Especially now that we have Google. Right? Just look it up. It's out there. There's an infinity of memory out there. And there's a point at which Augustine says, this is my memory and this am I myself. As though he is essentially saying, I am my memories. They define me. They speak to me. I speak back to them. they want to control me, I want to control them. Memory is that thing we fight with. It's that thing we cannot live with sometimes, but we also cannot live without. It's true of individuals. It's really true of collectives and groups and nations. Nations have memories. I think every nation has memories they can't really live with very well, but they have to find a way to do it. For Americans, arguably, I would argue, our most vexing problem to deal with in our memory has been in one way or another our Civil War and all of the potential legacies that have grown therefrom. And they are very much alive in this very moment, and I will come around to that. Faulkner said it, as Faulkner would, in a single sentence, in the mouth of one of his characters in the novel The Handmaiden. I mean, it wouldn't be a William Faulkner, right, without the problem of Southern memory, the burden of Southern memory, the burden of the South with its racial memory and its history with slavery. It wouldn't have been a Faulkner. But in The Hamlet, he puts this single line in the mouth of a character. The character says, "Only thing God men have done learn how to forget quick what they ain't brave enough to try to cure." Can't cure that problem? Don't know what to do about that problem? Forget it. Walk around it. Avoid it. Look away. And then there's Mark Twain, who, as only Twain could, warned us or cautioned us to believe in memory at all. It was Twain, you may know this line, it was Twain who said, "When I was a young man, I remembered everything, whether it happened or not. But now that I'm an old man, I remember only the things that never happened." You get older, just make it up. How many times have you told that incredible story about your youth, and you don't even care anymore if it's true? It just works. We all have them. I once struck out Steve Garvey in an inter-squad game at Michigan State. Man, I wanted to embellish that. I'm not even sure if I did. It's also called a myth, or whatever you want to call it. The past, though, and again, here we are, a place like this, it almost seems sacrilege to say it. But I've become a great, great fan of Robert Penn Warren's. He's the subject of he's one of the four main subjects of this most recent book. And Warren, who not only is famous for that great novel, All the King's Men, which I think you should have to read to have U.S. citizenship, that's just my opinion. You're not in any danger if you haven't, but I think you should, especially in an election year. But it was Warren who, in an almost throwaway line in a poem, once said, "History, it's the thing you can't resign from." You just can't quit it. As much as we like to, right? Human nature often works to get us to slough off the past, get rid of the past, live beyond the past, live above the past, forget it. Or as my mother always used to say, it was just meant to be. I think one of the reasons I adored my mother, the greatest woman I ever knew in all of my life, but I think one of the reasons I became a historian is because I hated her fatalism. I wanted to go study things and figure out, no, that can't be that they're just meant to be. Nothing is meant to be, I used to say to her. There was also Warren in that great little pamphlet that he wrote in 1961 at the height of the centennial of the Civil War, asked to write it by Life magazine as a long, remember the old long essay form in Life magazine? He's asked to write this piece by Jerry Korn, the editor, who challenged. By 1961, he was Robert Penn Warren, author of All the King's Men and a whole host of other novels and plays and short stories and poetry, the only American ever to win the Pulitzer Prize for fiction and poetry, and a lot of nonfiction essays and reviews about the Civil War, could never, ever, ever, ever get the Civil War out of his soul, where he said his soul had been soaked in with it. Warren wrote that little book in 1961, which to me is still the primer, the place to start with on the memory Civil War, Legacy of the Civil War. In that book, Warren, among other things, said, "The Civil War draws us as an oracle, darkly unriddled and portentous, of personal as well as national fate." Now that's a big statement, and we could get up an argument, especially in a library devoted to early American history, as to which part of our history, which big event in our history, which epoch of our history is our oracle. For some it's surely still the founding era, or the Constitution, or the Declaration of Independence. But if we have an event, and people abroad as well who want to understand this, if we have an event that we go to more than any other perhaps to ask, so who are we? What are we about? How did we become what we are? How did we have to go through what we've gone through to try to be what we are? The Civil War may be, if not the place, certainly one of them. But where would that oracle be? If you're an enthusiast of the Civil War, a student of the Civil War, a scholar of the Civil War period, and by that I mean the whole era and all of its results, where would your oracle be? Could be Cemetery Ridge in Gettysburg for some people, as a physical place. 2 million plus visitors a year go to Gettysburg. People go out on that battlefield and commune with it, try to understand what happened, or why did this happen? How could they do this? That so-called high water mark of the Confederacy. Oddly called that. Someday, maybe it might get renamed as a place of Union victory, but that's another story. Maybe it's Stone Mountain for some people in Georgia, where they can see the 3 great images on the side of a mountain of Confederate leadership. Maybe it's Confederate or Monument Avenue in Richmond, Virginia, with the 5 Confederate memorials that all went up between 1890 and 1910, which defined the revival of the city of Richmond. For some, their oracle might be, I'd include myself on this team, the Great Shaw Memorial in Boston. Standing there at the corner of Boston Common, looking up at the Massachusetts State Capitol, is the greatest work of public art ever done about the Civil War, Augustus St. Gaudens' masterpiece. That bas-relief is pure, living, moving genius of art, for one thing, with its 22 different images of black profiles, which he sculpted from the models that he recruited out of the train stations in New York and Boston, with Shaw on his horse. A monument that really does tell a story about the meaning of that war. Some people would consider that the oracle. I don't know. It could be a lot of places. It might be the Lincoln Memorial, America's national secular temple. I mean, if we have a single place that Americans of every conceivable persuasion have gone to appropriate and use, certainly more than the National Cathedral, more than the Capitol building itself, at least since 1922, it's been that Lincoln Memorial. And perhaps even the language inside the wall. Maybe your oracle, if you consider the Civil War one of your oracles of American history, is simply in language. Maybe it's a verse of a Whitman poem. Maybe it's a passage from Lincoln's second inaugural. Choose your paragraph. Mine would be the 3rd paragraph. It includes the language about slavery as the cause and emancipation as the result, and the language about retribution, that every drop of blood shed by the last shall be paid by blood drawn with the sword. We too often jump right to the last paragraph of that great speech and just talk about malice toward none, charity for all, and forget that in the previous paragraph he's just announced retribution. So maybe it's just in language, but wherever it is, it's certainly a place we go to ask, so who are we? While he was writing Legacy of the Civil War, Warren gets a letter from Jerry Corn, wife, and it's a private letter, and in the letter he says, "Dear Ray, to the American people why this event, why this war has such attraction for us. That's the word he used. What is it so attractive about this event? And of course, Corn was writing this in 1960. They're planning all kinds of reenactments. They're planning all kinds of commercialized blue-gray commemoration all over the country. The Civil War Centennial, even before the anniversary of Fort Sumter, was already becoming a massive commercial event. He asked Warren, explain the attraction. Warren writes back in a classic kind of homespun Warren metaphor. He says, well, Jerry, I suppose it's because we think that war made us, I won't mimic his accent, that war made us so great that we're a little bit like the dog sitting in front of the icebox staring at it. Is the Civil War and sometimes other historical events, are some other historical events like the Civil War, sometimes like that icebox that the dog just stares at, wants to know what's in it? Are we sometimes like a million rubberneckers at a gigantic, colossal, bloody accident called the Civil War, and we just can't stop looking at it? If you're in my field, as probably some of you are, everywhere I go to speak, somebody, although they don't do it anymore because I always use this line, everyone's afraid to after the lecture's over, but 2,000 times in my life it seems like someone that always comes up afterward or in the Q&A and will say, I've always just loved the Civil War. And I always want to answer that and say, what is it that you love about such a ghastly event that killed 650,000 people, left 1.2 million wounded, tore apart American society, destroyed the first American Republic, necessitated inventing another one? What is it that's so lovable about it? Of course, I don't do that, because that would be unfair. I understand the question, because I too grew up loving it. Loving it. We had every other year we have a conference at the Huntington Library in California on some aspect of the Civil War. I say we. It's all of us who can manage to scheme and get ourselves invited back each time by writing a paper that's about whatever the hell the theme is that they come up with. And one year, I don't know, 6 or 8 years ago, I can't remember the theme was memory, in fact. That one I had an easy time. But the first paper was given by Drew Faust, our friend at Harvard. She was at that point working on her Republic of Suffering book, the book on death. And she did it, maybe you've read the essay, it was subsequently published in Civil War History. She did a paper called Why We Love the Civil War. And it was an ironic tour de force. She took us through not only many literary examples, but even some historians in the room got quoted about why they loved the Civil War, sort of. And it was a blistering sort of critique of our whole culture's love affair with an event we had to clean up, sanitize, make comfortable and pleasurable over time in order to make it digestible in a culture that needed reconciliation. And the funny thing that happened was, she got the first paper over a 2.5-day conference. Every one of us who got up after her had to kind of fess up. You know, we all, well, I guess, yeah, I sort of loved this when I was a teenager and I got interested in this. Everybody had, you know, after a while, the audience started saying, enough already, okay, you know, we get it. You feel a little guilty, but it's okay. Even Jim McPherson got a little, you know, troubled by how they had to profess that. What's so lovable about civil wars? That's why the memory question is so important. I wrote this whole book, Race and Reunion, initially to try to sort of make us not love it anymore, but read about it. Gotta read about it. Go with me back to a moment all of us know. Everyone knows this moment. Even kids know this moment now. It's the rarest of things, though, isn't it? To find an event, a moment in the past that somehow everyone knows about. Iconic moments. The breeze of the intense intense heat, that the breeze eased the intense heat on the late August afternoon as a huge crowd, weary but peaceful and jubilant, leaned forward to listen. All along the reflecting pool of the Washington, D.C. Mall, people steadied their sore feet, peered up at the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, the unofficial secular temple of the United States. And Martin Luther King Jr., a Southern Baptist minister who had become the preeminent face and oratorical voice of the Civil Rights Movement, stepped to the microphone and delivered a short, transcendent oration to the world on the meaning of the unfinished American Civil War and thereby on the meaning of America. I'm referring, of course, to the I Have a Dream speech. Always and forever it will be remembered as the I Have a Dream speech. But this is how it began. This is the opening paragraph of the dream speech. The dream metaphor, mind you, as you may know, doesn't come until after the 14th minute of a 17-minute speech. The dream metaphor is only in the final 3 minutes. The first 14 minutes are all about the 100th anniversary of Emancipation and the Civil War and its unfinished quality. It begins 50 years ago. Gee, what's he referring to there? A great American in whose symbolic shadow we stand today signed the Emancipation Proclamation. This momentous decree, I'm still quoting King, came as a beacon light of hope to millions of Negro slaves who had been seared in the flames of withering injustice. It came as a joyous daybreak to end the long night of their captivity. But 100 years later, and this becomes the first refrain of the speech, which he'll use 4 times. But 100 years later, the Negro is still not free. 100 years later, the life of the Negro is still sadly crippled by the manacles of segregation and the chains of discrimination. 100 years later, the Negro lives on an island of poverty in the midst of a vast ocean of material prosperity. 100 years later, the Negro is still languished in the corners of American society and finds himself in exile in his own land. No one watching that speech, if they could hear it, no one watching it on television that was televised live, and no one reading it or watching it today. And by the way, pull it up on YouTube. It takes 2 clicks. Just Google King's Dream Speech, click one more time, and you can watch it. Watch the speech. You'll wait a long time for the dream metaphor. It's all about America's troubled, vexed, mostly erased memory of emancipation. What King was doing in the I Have a Dream speech, he knew exactly what he was doing. Its genius is that he was really giving the Gettysburg Address of the 20th century. He was arguing exactly the same thing Lincoln argued at Gettysburg. What did Lincoln argue, actually? We remember the words of the Gettysburg Address. We probably recite most of them. We can recite it like we've just seen it on a restaurant placemat. But what's the argument of the Gettysburg Address? Buried, not buried, but right there in the middle of it. You know, 4score, our fathers brought forth, yada, 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 dedicated to the proposition, all men are created equal. He actually used the word. Ends without the people, by the people, for the people. But in the middle, Lincoln used the central metaphor of rebirth. The argument of the Gettysburg Address is essentially, he's saying, folks, the first American Republic, created 40 and some years ago, 80 some years ago, is dying. It's being buried in these graves here in front of us. We have killed it. We have to remake it. Lincoln doesn't have a blueprint yet. He doesn't know exactly where this is going yet. He wasn't God and prescient of all things to come, as a few of his hagiographers almost imply. But he's arguing the first republic is being killed and must be reinvented. What's King arguing in the Dream speech? That Second American Republic, created out of the Civil War, created out of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, created out of the emancipation of 4 million slaves, has failed. It's being killed in the Civil Rights Revolution, and we have to make another one. But it's not how we remember the I Have a Dream speech. We much prefer our children to know that speech as a speech about little black children and little white children sitting on a hillside and getting along. Who's against that? No one's against that. But it's not the real argument of most of the speech. It doesn't work in commercials the way the dream does. And by the way, that grand lobbying crusade that was the March on Washington in 1963 has a backstory. And I write about it to some extent in my book. But actually, I had a senior thesis student last spring at Yale, Allison Sharfstein, who's actually teaching right now in Boston. God bless her, she became a teacher. I hope she stays. She took that 2 or 3 paragraphs in my book and read about it in one other place. And she went to the Kennedy Library and a whole lot of other archives and wrote a brilliant senior thesis on the lobbying effort of King and the Southern Christian Leadership Council, SCLC, King's Organization of Southern Ministers, the lobbying effort they engaged in from 2 weeks after John Kennedy was inaugurated in January 1961, all the way, frankly, to Kennedy's death, trying to convince the Kennedy White House to issue a second Emancipation Proclamation. They wanted an executive order modeled precisely on Lincoln's. Why? Probably obvious to you, because they had no faith that Congress, which was then still in the early 60s, controlled by Southern Democrats, the committees tended to be controlled by Southern Democrats, by segregationists. They saw no hope that a legal end to segregation, no matter how successful the civil rights movement was on the ground as direct action, when the law got changed, they thought it would be an executive order. And, for some good reasons. 2 weeks after Kennedy is inaugurated, he sent a telegram to, King sent a telegram to Kennedy asking Kennedy to consider this. They lobbied the White House like the Dickens. They especially worked through Arthur Schlesinger, the White House historian. They also worked through Harris Wofford, later senator from Pennsylvania, who was the White House's civil rights lawyer and a very strong supporter of civil rights. They worked through Bobby Kennedy at times, the Attorney General. The next spring, in May of 1962, I have a hard time getting out of the 19th century. In May of 1962, May 17th to be exact, King held a very public news conference in Washington, D.C. and issued a 65-page manifesto. I actually have I carry a copy around. I don't even know why, but here it is. You can now get it. It's actually now on the website of the JFK Library, thanks to Allison Sharfstein. This amazing document was produced by King's lawyers. The first 4 pages, 4 or 5 pages, is like a preamble, and that may indeed have been written by King himself. On the title page, it lists King as the sole author. The last 60 pages were written by his lawyers, because it's nothing but a legal document. It's one precedent after another. It's a legal brief for how they believe in one precedent after another the president had the authority to issue such an executive order outlawing segregation and any form of legal discrimination forever, just as Lincoln in a similar crisis had outlawed slavery in the interest of saving the Union. It was a very public news conference, May 17th, and actually Allison and I published an op-ed in the New York Times last May 17th on its 50th anniversary. Her first op-ed in the New York Times. She wrote the first draft, I promise you. I even admitted that to her parents. At any rate, it wasn't getting anywhere with the White House, as you know. The Kennedy White House had a terrible problem, a torturous problem, dealing with civil rights in 61 and 62, and even into 63, although eventually they did embrace the movement on the ground in the South, had to. at Ole Miss and at other places. Now that such an executive order never came about doesn't surprise us. Kennedy dies, of course, is assassinated, LBJ takes over. They had LBJ out speaking about civil rights in many places they would never send the president. It's interesting. LBJ was in some ways already the voice of civil rights for the Kennedy administration while he was vice president. I had never quite understood that. The point of all of this is that at that moment, while the country is having this massive commemoration of the Civil War with huge budgets from the federal Congress and huge budgets in many states, especially southern states, a commemoration of the Civil War at the centennial period that never, almost never even mentioned the story of emancipation or that there had been black soldiers in the war. Now you and I, as good historians, may look back and sort of understand that. This was the late 50s and early 60s. What did Americans even know about black history in the late 50s and early 60s? What could they garner from mainstream sources? What did they garner from their textbooks? Go back and look at textbooks circa 1960. Not much. I would venture that the vast majority of Americans, white and black, in 1960 knew very little about actually how emancipation ever came about. Well, Lincoln freed the slaves. Yeah, that's about all you needed to know. And then the Union Army had something to do with it. The problem with the Civil War Centennial and the Civil Rights Movement is that they were like, and I go on at length about this in the book, they were like separate planets orbiting separate suns. They were almost never in the same space. The best or worst example of that, and then I'll leave it, was they realized they were going to have to do something about September 22nd, 1962, 50th, 100th anniversary of Lincoln's preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. Had to do something. It had to be at the Lincoln Memorial. And the official U.S. Civil War Centennial Commission by then, because Kennedy had fired the original white supremacists who ran it, which included Ulysses S. Grant III, by the way. Yes, Grant's great-grandson was a flaming racist. I'm sorry, it's just the truth. He and a couple other people were the executive council of the U.S. Civil War Centennial until they were fired in the summer of 1961 for the segregationist debacle that they oversaw in Charleston at the attempt to have the 100th anniversary of Fort Sumter. When one sole delegate who was African American showed up from the New Jersey Civil War Centennial Commission, was not allowed to stay in the Francis Marion Hotel, Kennedy intervened. That's how crazy segregation was, folks. The President of the United States intervened, moved the whole affair across to Sullivan's Island. They all stayed in a Navy barracks, and it was headlines all over the country. Embarrassed the Kennedy administration. He fired them and he put Allen Nevins in charge. Great historian, Columbia University, author of many books on the Civil War, was in the middle then of writing Ordeal of the Union, his 8-volume epic study of the Civil War era. He didn't want to do the executive work, so he hired Bud Robertson, James Bud Robertson, who was a young guy in his early 30s and a Virginian. And he had a great Southern drawl. And he could go out to all those Southern state centennial commissions and try to talk them into doing something more balanced than to simply celebrate the Confederacy and to celebrate the lost cause, which is what they were doing. But what to do about September 22nd? Well, they planned an event at the Lincoln Memorial. It was announced that President Kennedy would be the speaker. King, leaders of the Civil Rights Movement, got very excited. They thought, maybe he'll do it. Is he going to announce maybe some kind of modified? Kennedy did eventually issue an executive order about housing discrimination. He actually did do that. They were hoping for some, if not piecemeal, some little piece. But about 2 weeks before the event, Kennedy White House decided civil rights is just way too sensitive at this moment. This is 1962. and it was announced that Kennedy had a scheduling conflict. And the scheduling conflict was the America's Cup yacht race off Nantucket, which is where the president went. And in his place was Adlai Stevenson. Stevenson was to be the speaker. Now, that had a certain logic to it. He was ambassador to the UN, he'd been the Democratic Party's standard bearer twice in the 50s, and he was from Illinois. And he was a Lincoln expert, supposedly. And so Adlai would be the keynote speaker, and at the last minute, they got Thurgood Marshall to show up, Supreme Court Justice, and make a few remarks, and Mahalia Jackson to sing the Battle Hymn of the Republic. The event came off. It was completely boycotted by all Southern Civil War Centennial commissions. It was boycotted by Southern congressmen. It was denounced by Southern congressmen. And Adlai Stevenson's speech is fascinating because it's almost entirely about the Cold War. Now that doesn't surprise us either. This is 1962. It's all about how the United States became a greater nation and international power after we put ourselves back together after our Civil War, and how we were a beacon of light to all those freedom-seeking peoples across the planet. It's a thoroughgoing Cold War speech. It barely mentioned emancipation. That is simply one little measure of how difficult, 50 years ago, it was to even find a place, the Lincoln Memorial, to put these two stories together, civil rights and Civil War, emancipation and Civil War, couldn't be put together. Now we're in a very different place today. Very different place today.